me right, not impaired, although it could also be that. The Pear Burger is one of Dum Dum Burger's most unique and surprising creations. I agree, very surprising. Showcasing their willingness to experiment with unconventional ingredients. It was launched in 2021 on the anniversary of Pear Harbor. Just kidding, can you imagine? Let's open it up and see what it looks like.
Whoosh.
First of all, they have absolutely nailed the look of each of these. The same sesame seed bun on top. The next layer after that, you've got a thick dollop of mayonnaise.
I want to give him something special.
I'm home!
Welcome home, Daddy! Daddy! This
Pringles, not just a snack, but a revolution in a can. Since its debut in 1968, Pringles have literally reshaped the snack aisle with their unmistakable saddle shape and iconic cylindrical can that rakes in over $3 billion every year. The genius behind this snacking marvel was Frederick Bauer, a chemist at Procter & Gamble who envisioned a solution to the common complaints about traditional potato chips. Too greasy, always broken, and half-filled bags that seemed to be more air than chips. Frederick's mission was to create a chip that retained its shape and freshness in a package that was both convenient and stylish. His outcome was nothing short of a snacking sensation, a chip that stayed crisp and tasty and neatly stacked in a can that kept every piece intact until the very last crunch. Procter & Gamble initially marketed them as Pringles Newfangled Potato Chips, and their novel appeal quickly brought some unexpected scrutiny. It soon became apparent that the name potato chip didn't quite fit the bill, since they're made with about 42% dehydrated potato flakes, not whole potatoes, and include a blend of other ingredients like rice flour and wheat starch. So consequently, in 1975, the FDA mandated they be rebranded from potato chips to potato crisps, a change that clarified labeling in North America but caused some confusion in the UK, where potato chips are traditionally referred to as crisps. So what exactly goes into a Pringle if they're not entirely whole potatoes? Let's peel back the lid and go inside the factory to see the fascinating process that takes humble potato flakes and turns them into the poppable phenomenon we know as Pringles. The potato flakes for Pringles begin with large batches of high-quality fresh potatoes, and these spuds have a thrilling multi-step journey ahead of them. As soon as they arrive at the factory, they're whisked onto a conveyor belt and immediately taken to the washing station. This isn't just any rinse though. The potatoes are soaked in this large tank, where a hydro washer agitates the water, loosening any dirt and debris clinging to their surfaces. Now squeaky clean, the potatoes are prepped for peeling. To get rid of their skins, the spuds tumble into this large drum lined with a surface that's as rough as very coarse sandpaper. As they spin and dance around, the abrasive texture gently rubs away their skin, removing any layers that might get in the way of a silky smooth Pringle. After shedding their skins, the potatoes are on the move again, this time along this conveyor that leads them to the cutting station. But first, they take a quick detour into this blanching bath. This quick dip in hot water does double duty. It not only softens the potatoes to facilitate a smooth, even cut, but also helps inactivate enzymes that could affect the taste and color of the final chip. The machine used to cut the spuds rolls them in this giant cylinder spinning at 1,200 times per minute. As the potatoes reach the top, they come in contact with a blade that slices them. Almost as soon as that happens, the sliced potatoes are cut into strips. Just as quickly, another set of rotating blades chops the strips into little cubes. This blink and you'll miss it process is essential for making the following steps easier. Next, the potato cubes continue traveling along the conveyor until they're dropped onto a separate vibrating belt. The vibrations help to make sure that freshly cut pieces don't clump together, which could cause problems. Several cameras also check for any blemishes or bad spots on the spuds. To cook them, the cubes are dropped into 185 degrees Fahrenheit boiling water, where they'll stay for about 2 minutes. Even though it's a short period, this process helps ensure that potatoes don't turn to mush when they are sent through the giant steam cooker. This giant machine then steam cooks the cubes at a temperature of 345 degrees Fahrenheit. Now that the spud cubes are cooked to perfection, it's time to whip them up into a smooth, lump-free mash that sets the stage for every Pringles crisp. This transformation happens inside this giant industrial drum, where a robust metal arm tirelessly churns the cubes into an impeccably smooth potato mash. Now, the real magic begins. The prepared potato mash undergoes a significant transformation. Applied uniformly onto this large, rotating drum dryer, the mash is exposed to intense heat. As the drum spins, moisture is quickly evaporated from the mash, forming it into thin and pliable sheets. This process not only preserves the flavor and quality of the potatoes, but also prepares the dried product for precise milling into the fine potato flakes used for the Pringles dough. Now that the potato sheets are perfectly dried, it's crunch time. They're now turned into the essential building blocks of every Pringle, the potato flakes. The dried sheets are fed through this milling machine, where a series of sharp blades break the sheets down into perfectly proportioned flakes. To the untrained eye, these flakes look like something you'd have for breakfast in the morning or even sand.
Sometimes projects can involve multiple documents. Adobe Acrobat streamlines our processes, allowing us to combine and organize all the files for a project and share for review without needing multiple email attachments.
The next stage is where the whole potatoes begin their transition into the unique base that sets Pringles apart from ordinary potato chips. With our potato flakes at the ready, it's time to bring in the supporting cast of ingredients. In this large mixer, the flakes are combined with water, cornstarch, rice flour, wheat starch, degerminated yellow corn flour, maltodextrin, diglycerides, salt, and emulsifiers, in which ensures the mixture stays fresh and stable throughout the rest of the process. When the mixture is complete, the potato flake dough will resemble coarse wet sand, instead of the dough used for making bread. Next, the dough mixture rides on this conveyor belt that sends it through an auger, which evenly spreads the dough across the conveyor, ensuring that each portion has uniform consistency, setting the stage for the perfect rollout. Once evenly spread on the conveyor, the dough continues through this giant roller that presses it with 4 tons of pressure into a long and very thin sheet, just 1 millimeter in thickness. Without knowing that it's actually made from potato flakes, you could very easily mistake it for a giant sheet of paper or linen. As the thin dough sheet continues its journey, it's fed into a giant rolling cutter that slices the dough into oval shapes. At this point, the snack begins to resemble the shape millions know it for. Here's a fun fact. Inside the Pringles factory, workers have a playful nickname for these shapes. They call them doughvals, a clever twist on the word ovals. Once the dough has been cut into doughfuls, the remaining unused dough is pulled along by a different belt. Rather than being thrown away, it's recycled and sent back into the mixing stage, ready to be rolled out and shaped once again. This recycling loop is a simple but clever way to minimize waste and keep production efficient. As for the oval cut dough, its journey continues towards the fryer, where it will take on its famous saddle shape. While in the fryer, a large roller molds the dough slices into a thin concave shape. Or, if you want to get more technical, this shape is what mathematicians would call a hyperbolic paraboloid. During this process, the Pringles are cooked in hot oil at 392 degrees Fahrenheit for about 11 seconds. This step serves 2 purposes. The first is to lock in their shape, and the second is to give them their desired crisp, golden finish that sets the stage for their satisfying crunch. Now that they're fully cooked, the Pringles are sent through a hot air blower, which gets rid of excess oil and lowers the temperature to about 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Then, the conveyor carries them under a cascade of seasoning that ensures each Pringle gets the perfect amount on the top side. The flavor of the toppings will change depending on the types of Pringles being made. From the classic tang of sour cream and onion to the savory goodness of pizza and the rich taste of cheddar cheese, each Pringle is meticulously flavored. Daily, Pringles utilizes more than 5,952 pounds of spices to season its expansive range of 160 flavors. What's your go-to flavor? Drop your favorite in the comments and see who shares your taste. After they've been seasoned, the Pringles are sent along another conveyor belt. Thanks to their unique saddle shape, they naturally fall into neat piles, simplifying the tasks that lie ahead in the production line. As they continue their journey, a quality control person inspects the Pringles. Specifically, they are looking for any that might have been broken by the process, are underseasoned, or have any flaws that would drop a Pringle below its desired quality. At this point, the Pringles are on their way to being packed into one of the famous canisters. Along the way, they are shaken up a bit by a different conveyor belt to ensure the Pringles aren't all clumped together. The stacks of Pringles are then placed on scales to ensure the proper amount of weight goes into each canister before an automated spoon feeds the stacks into the open end of a canister. Once inside, automated guides tap the closed end of the tube to nudge the Pringles into position. Once the canisters are neatly filled with perfectly stacked Pringles, they advance to the sealing station. Here, automated machines precisely apply the tear-off freshness seals to the tops of each canister. This ensures that each chip remains perfectly crisp from the factory floor to your first pop of the lid. Now, mechanical arms lower the canisters to a separate station. Once there, a spinning machine attaches metal bottoms to each can. This final step closes the canisters and seals them tight, locking in the freshness. On the opposite end, the canisters are already fitted with the plastic lid. Did you know that across the globe, Pringles offers its delectable snacks in 5 different canister sizes, catering to all sorts of appetites? Before shipping, Pringles undergo a unique quality control test, where flavor experts conduct blind taste tests that prevents visual judgments based on the chip's appearance, focusing solely on taste. Testers evaluate each Pringle on its doneness, texture, and seasoning by placing it seasoned side up on their tongue and fully experiencing the flavor as they chew. If a single chip fails, the entire batch that the Pringle came from is tossed. After passing strict quality control tests for taste, texture, and appearance, Pringles begin their journey to consumers. The canisters are packed into boxes and loaded onto trucks for distribution. These boxes then travel to distribution centers around the globe before reaching retail stores and supermarkets, ensuring Pringles lovers can always find their favorite flavors. So, as we can see, despite being thin, slightly potato-flavored, and crunchy, Pringles are definitely not potato chips. And if you're in the UK, they aren't exactly crisps either. No matter what you call them, Pringles and their inventors, chemist Fred Bauer and researcher Alexander Lipa, changed the snack industry forever. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey through the Pringles factory. If you like what you saw, remember to like and subscribe to Made Vision for more fascinating content. We'll see you next time.
Ganyan lang pala pag Pringle.
Are you
Ito. Turned his
Wrapped in
father's
gold and exuding elegance, the coveted Ferrero Rocher holds inside it one of the most guarded secrets in the food industry. The recipe began more than a century ago and has remained in the hands of one family for 4 generations, all thanks to one Italian who turned his father's local bakery into a multi-billion-dollar company and one of the most distinctive chocolate brands in history. This is the story of Michele Ferrero. Michele Ferrero was born in 1989 in Piedmont, northwest Italy. The area is known for its border with Switzerland, with the Alps forming a cinematic background. Michele grew up in the small town of Alba, in between Turin and Genoa, on the southern part of Piedmont. It's home to some of the country's most prestigious vineyards in the country, a rich Roman history, and architectural sites dating as far back as the 12th century. It was in this town that Michele's father, Pietro, began a humble bakery with a grand vision. Pietro had been trained as a pastry chef and developed an obsession with finding the right balance of cocoa and hazelnuts, which were easy to source locally. This quest led to Pietro's own version of gianduja, a thick, dark chocolatey paste, which was created in the region, helping to make Piedmont famous for chocolate. With Pietro's recipe, though, which he marketed as pasta gianduja, this creamy spread would go from a regional delight to a nationwide bestseller. Pasta gianduja quickly became a hit. It was packaged in aluminum foil in small loaves that needed to be cut with a knife. In 1946, together with his brother Giovanni, Pietro formed the company Ferrero to grow the business from a pastry shop and small chocolatier into a large company. Strangely, Pietro's best business decision wasn't in his shop at all. It was when his wife, Pietra, gave birth to their only child, Michele, in 1925. Michele grew up in Alba, which at the time was a small rural town, with little activity. By the time his career was over, Michele would have turned this town into not only a regional destination, but the engine room of a global powerhouse. Michele learned the trade by following his father closely, but he was marred by tragedy when his father died young, at just 51 years old, leaving the business in the hands of his brother, Giovanni, and Michele. Less than a decade later, Giovanni died too, leaving Michele heartbroken and in charge of a growing business. Michele's father's products were unique, and the ingredients he used as his signature were largely out of necessity. Hazelnuts offered a cheaper substitute for chocolate, which was difficult to import, especially during wartime when the rest of Europe cut Italy off. But Pietro's ingenuity led to him establishing a company, a workshop, and acquiring a factory to ramp up production. Pietro Ferrero could never have imagined how his pasta gianduja would be again transformed after his son took over the company. Michele started his leadership with a bold move. Instead of a chocolate bar or used as a filling, his genius move was to create a chocolate spread. Super Crema, as launched in 1949, 2 years after Michele took the reins. And it was an instant hit. The spread was affordable to the average Italian. It turned chocolate from a luxury product into an everyday one. Super Crema was kept in a jar, joining the shelf next to other spreads used on bread. And immediately, Michele proved himself to be a visionary. He sent a truck painted in the company's colors, traveling around Italy and giving out chocolate to children. Michele understood what very few of his competitors did at the time, that advertising and marketing could create demand. Within a decade of Michele's leadership, Ferrero had opened up 3 new factories, 2 of them outside Italy. The key to his success was moving into the German market, where he converted old missile factories into candy manufacturers. Michele took advantage of the post-war infrastructure and an increased appetite for confectionery bars, which had developed during the war as rations were handed out. In 1964, Michele made another defining move. He changed the name of Super Crema to Nutella, which combined the English word nut with an Italian diminutive associated with other food like mozzarella, portobello, and citronella. But it wasn't a simple rebranding. Michele had inherited his father's obsession with finding the right balance of ingredients. And when he did, Nutella was launched with a different recipe to Super Crema, one that remains top secret to this day. It is so guarded that there are no media tours allowed of factories, and the original recipe was reportedly once translated into Arabic and locked in an Egyptian vault. This was a product that was widely marketed to all consumers, quickly becoming a favorite of European children. And Michele's masterful stroke of giving the name worldwide appeal opened up new markets. In 1983, he exported the product to the United States, which launched it into a global sensation. Michele saw the success of Nutella, but had no intentions of slowing down. In 1968, he created a product marketed exclusively to children, calling it Kinder, which means children in German. Michele had already expanded production to Germany and had confidence that he could appeal to the market's tastes. He was right. Kinder was a more traditional confectionery than Nutella or Ferrero Rocher, but the specific combination of milk chocolate, sugar, milk powder, and cocoa put it a step above the rest. The brand has gone on to release a range of different products, including Kinder Surprise Egg-shaped chocolate encasing a small toy, Kinder Bueno wafer sticks, Kinder Maxi King ice creams, and dozens more. The target demographic continues to be children. Michele's genius was in his marketing. He was able to keep a squeaky clean, luxury image for the company, all the while launching different products for different markets, segmenting each with its own brand. And just over 3 decades after inheriting his father's business, he was ready to unveil his masterpiece. In 1979, Michele introduced the world to a chocolate that has become one of the most sought after in the world. Its inception was semi-religious. Michele took the name Rocher from the grotto where a saint once reported a vision of the Virgin Mary. Michele traveled to Rocher de Messabielle in Lourdes, in southern France, as a pilgrimage. He was so inspired that he coined the name Ferrero Rocher for his new chocolate, and continued to visit Lourdes for the rest of his life. The profound meaning behind the chocolate is matched by its ingenious composition. Ferrero Rocher is made up of 3 layers: a full crunchy hazelnut, which is dipped in Nutella, and then wrapped in a wafer shell topped with chocolate and roasted hazelnut pieces. But the candy has also become famous for its 4th layer, the packaging. Each piece is wrapped in gold foil, glued to a paper cup and stamped with the brand name. This aesthetic makes it a pseudo-high-end product, loosely associated with wealth and decadence. The packaging has become so distinctive that plastic boxes or displays are always made as clear as possible to emphasize the gold wrapping. They have become staples of celebration. More than half of Ferrero Rocher's sales occur in the last 3 months of the year, in the lead up to Christmas and New Year's Eve. And there are now a variety of different flavors too. Michele continued to aggressively globalize both sales and production, spreading Ferrero's product spread to the rest of the world. He diversified the sourcing of raw materials and built up 8 factories across 5 continents, along with sales offices. Michele Ferrero steered his father's chocolate company into worldwide success by fiercely protecting the company's image. He did this by segmenting the company into
Ferrero.
2 distinct brands. Ferrero Rocher was a product of decadence and prosperity. Kinder was marketed for children, and Nutella was an all-purpose general product. The company has remained politically neutral and rarely offers sponsorship deals. Michele's connection to his roots never wavered either. He funded the expansion of bus lines to draw workers in from further in the countryside and funded a variety of social programs. Keeping a local population of workers who were embedded in the community as much as Michele himself is why there has never been a strike at the Ferrero factory. In just a few years after releasing Ferrero Rocher, he established the Ferrero Foundation in his hometown of Alba, which features a kindergarten, a school, a bar, workshops, fitness rooms, and even medical facilities. The building is available to employees who have spent more than 25 years with the company. The Ferrero company remains in the family to this day. After Michele's passing, his sons Giovanni and Pietro, named after his father and uncle, took over the company. In 2019, the Ferrero Group had over $11 billion in annual revenue, and in 2018, purchased $2.8 billion worth of businesses from Nestle, its largest competitor, to deeper entrench its hold on the global food market. Ferrero is the largest buyer of hazelnuts in the world. As a staple of their major products, Ferrero consumes around 25% of the entire global production of hazelnuts. Michele Ferrero's lasting impact is felt best in his hometown of Alba, which was once a barn cultural community. Now 1/5 of the population is now employed by Ferrero, while the headquarters of the global empire remains in nearby Turin. When Michele Ferrero died in 2015, he was the richest man in Italy, with a net worth of around $25 billion. His obituary in Forbes magazine attributed his wealth simply to chocolates, and there was a statue of him in Alba, cementing his place as the king of chocolate.
When you write, your tone influences how readers respond. With Grammarly, just highlight your text and type how you want to sound.
After being fired from the biggest food processing company in town, one man decided to go into business himself. He never envisioned that it would grow into one of the most dominant food companies in history, generating billions of dollars a year. This is the story of Lay's Chips. It all began in 1909, when Herman Lay was born into a quiet middle-class family in Charlotte, North Carolina. His father was a bookkeeper, and his mother was a stay-at-home wife. Growing up, there was no clear career path for him, but what he did excel at was sales. As a young boy, he operated a soda stand for locals, which was so successful that he hired employees. This entrepreneurial instinct would serve him well later in his career. But Lay was restless during college. He was more interested in the art of business than studying. Keen to get involved with the world, he dropped out, despite being admitted on a fully funded athletic scholarship. He headed to Sunshine Biscuits, a food company that manufactured cookies, crackers, and cereal, and it looked to be the first stepping stone to a career in business. But the Great Depression struck in 1929, wiping out 24% of the workforce nationwide and cutting any remaining income in half. At the time, Lay was just 20 years old and suddenly found himself out of a job. This taught him to diversify his income and build something that would provide him with more independence. At his next job working for the Bartlett Food Company, he began a side hustle that was destined to transform the U.S. food market. Lay was now in Nashville, Tennessee, in the heart of the American South, and this is where he began to experiment with a product that proved more popular than he imagined. Lay made it his trademark to bring bags of potato chips to his customers. As a traveling salesman, he quickly earned a reputation for stocking chips in the back of his Ford Model A. He was benefiting from a recent innovation in the market. Potato chips had existed since the 1850s, when thinly sliced baked potatoes were discovered to be an altogether different experience than eating larger chunks or French fries, which was common at the time. This new kind of potato, named the Saratoga chip for where it was conceived, had become popular in New York, but the nation hadn't shown an appetite for it. That was until 1926, when a method was developed for sealing potato chips in wax wax paper bags to keep the chips fresh. It allowed them to become portable snacks. Herman Lay latched onto this innovation and saw the huge potential for potato chips. The Barrett Food Company allowed Lay to sell large chips that would last for days while maintaining the quality you might expect at a restaurant. And after seeing the popularity, he decided to gamble on himself. He had over a decade in the food industry under his belt and took out a bank loan to purchase a dealership from his former employee. He renamed it H.W. Lay Distribution Co. And just a few years later, he raised $40,000 in stock sale to purchase the entire Barrett Food Company. One of Lay's biggest investors, who owned a shop across the street from the factory, was devastated. His family's life savings had been poured into Lay's company, and the takeover seemed like too big of a risk. But Lay was determined. He was inspired to create an affordable potato chip brand that the average American could enjoy and envision huge growth. The first Lay's chips were sold for 10 cents a packet. The brand soon became so popular that it was forced to gear up mass production to keep up with demand. With plenty of competitors, though, Lay's would need to stand out from the rest. This is where Herman Lay's genius marketing came into play. Lay's became the first snack food company to advertise on television in 1944. Later, they hired the actor who played the Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz to serve as a celebrity spokesperson. A popular TV campaign, including the line, "Bet you can't eat just one," helped to establish Lay's as the premier potato chip brand in America.
Lay's potato chips, bet you can't eat one.
Another key ingredient was the innovation of their products. They were first to offer crinkle-cut ruffled chips, which were less likely to break inside the package. And by 1950, Lay's led the market for potato chips. But this year, Lay's made a decision that would future-proof it against competitors and prove to be the greatest marketing tool of all. Lay's had been quietly pursuing the rights to use a patented cooking technique developed by Joe Spud Murphy, the owner of the Irish potato chip manufacturer, Tayto. Murphy had discovered a way to add seasoning during the cooking process and retain flavor on a scale of mass production. The first two flavors released were cheese and onion and salt and vinegar, flavors that would later become some of Lay's most in-demand products. After securing the rights for flavored potato chips, Lay's began to release flavors of their own. This innovation helped catapult the company to a new level, where its competitors were left behind. By the early 1960s, Herman Lay was still the head of H.W. Lay & Company, which was generating $45 million in annual sales. That would be $500 million in sales in 2023. But one huge competitor was standing in the way of total market dominance, and that was the Frito Company, a corn chip company outselling Lay's by 30%. Frito had a similar origin story to Lay's, when founder C.E. Doolin bought the recipe for corn chips from a small cafe in San Antonio and baked the chips from his mother's kitchen. Just like Herman Lay, Doolin didn't have a shop and was forced to sell them from his Ford car. Luckily, they quickly became popular, growing into a regional empire. The two entrepreneurs were operating 900 miles from one another, but their interests were about to collide. Instead of waging a war, Herman Lay orchestrated a deal that merged the two companies to make Frito-Lay, creating the first national American brand. And in a testament to his business genius, he had kept himself in power as CEO of the new company. After the merger in 1961, Frito-Lay quickly released a range of new chips, including many now iconic brands like Doritos, Funyuns, Munchos, and Pringles. And the stage was set for the genesis of a second business move that would create one of the biggest food companies of all time. In 1965, Herman Lay met with a businessman named Don Kendall about another potential merger. This time, it would be with a beverage company. Lay saw that joining the two would consolidate power over the American market and allow for aggressive international expansion. After Lay wrote the proposal on the back of a napkin, Don Kendall accepted. At the time, Kendall was the CEO of Pepsi-Cola, which had been around since 1868, developed a variety of drinks including Mountain Dew, Diet Pepsi, and 7-Up. Their chief competition was Coca-Cola, and Pepsi was eager to try and build itself an edge. Frito-Lay continued to function as a subsidiary of Pepsi, but the extra backing gave them more power to
Matagal gumaling ang ubo, marami kasing plema, virus at bakterya sa lungs. Mag-Soyox Advance, now in liquid. Magaling maglinis ng lungs.
expand internationally into the global behemoth they are today. Frito-Lay now employs 55,000 people, producing enough potatoes to reach the moon and back. This has helped to grow PepsiCo's annual revenue to $85.5 billion. In 2021, Lay's accounted for a staggering 41% of the potato chip market, and behind them were Ruffles and Pringles, which are also owned by Frito-Lay. Frito-Lay products occupy as much as 80% of shelf space in convenience stores. A large part of their success comes from their ability to innovate new flavors. There are country-specific and region-specific flavors that cater to local tastes, which is why there are now over 200 varieties of Lay's chips, ranging from nori seaweed to baked scallop. The company even offers up to $1 million for contestants who submit great new ideas. And their head flavor researcher is an OP restaurant chef. Lay's has moved into international markets, where Lay's chips were renamed Walkers in the United Kingdom, Smiths in Australia, Sabritas in Mexico, and Chipsy in Egypt. Herman Lay started Lay's chips after delivering chips to his customers as a traveling salesman. He converted a $2,000 loan into a global empire that twice merged to become a key part of PepsiCo, where he sat on the executive council until his death in 1982. He turned to philanthropy later in life, establishing the Lay Scholarship in hopes that he would help another entrepreneurial young mind create the next sensation. Lay has been described as a mastermind in the food that built America, and his legacy lives on in almost every supermarket and convenience store in the world.
There was a time when anyone would tremble upon hearing the name John D. Rockefeller. Not only was he the world's first billionaire, he's one of the richest people in history. His empire, Standard Oil, became the most dominant monopoly in the world by brutally crushing competitors, taking control of multiple industries, driving the government into submission, and treating business as if it was war. Because of his ruthless business practices and secretive deals, Rockefeller made many enemies. His career is filled with bitter rivalries like with Andrew Carnegie, and even ferocious battles against US presidents. But before he was the titan of the oil industry, Rockefeller was at the very bottom of society. His story is one of only a handful of cases where someone manages to rise from the depth of poverty to the absolute peak of wealth and power. Rockefeller's story is at times inspiring, and at times chilling. It's an example of what happens when greed and ambition go completely unchecked. So, let me take you back to 1839, where a young John D. Rockefeller is born into poverty.
Imagine creating an engaging video with one click. People absorb 10 times the amount of information watching video compared to reading text, except it's so hard and
In 1839, John D. Rockefeller was the first child born into a family of peasant farmers with no cash to spare. In his small town of less than 1,000, the most mysterious character to be found was undoubtedly John's father, who was known as Devil Bill. Instead of helping on the family farm, Bill did just about anything else. He was an athlete, ventriloquist, hunter, hypnotist, and even an animal trainer. Once he won a bear in a competition, kept it as a pet, and taught it to do tricks. Bill did a little of this, a little of that, but not much of anything. Bill would also spontaneously skip town in the middle of the night, leaving John and his siblings to fend for themselves for weeks or even months, only to reappear in a luxurious carriage and shower John and his siblings with toys and gifts. And this confused John, because his family lived in a crumbling old house, wore tattered clothes, and they were hungry and cold every night. They lived a pitiful life, with these occasional bouts of luxury when his father returned. And the reason for that was because Bill lived a secret double life as a con artist. Whenever he disappeared, Bill changed his name from William Rockefeller to Dr. William Livingston, and traveled from town to town selling useless herbal remedies and potions to the sick and desperate. Because Bill was usually far away running scams, John's mother enlisted John's help working at the farm, where she instilled a strong religious faith and sense of duty in him while they plowed the fields. For a boy younger than 10, balancing school and farming was backbreaking, but it taught him the value of discipline and hard work. John was proud to be helping his family out. In fact, he even started coming up with other ways to make money. For example, John once followed a wild turkey into the woods, stole its eggs, and raised the hatchlings. When they matured into turkeys, John sold some of them for a tidy profit, and kept the rest so he could get more eggs and repeat the process. Despite his young age, John was now pitching in a few dollars every week, and was making a serious impact on the family's finances. It looked like the Rockefellers might finally have a decent and stable life. However, when John was 10, his father Bill was accused of sexually assaulting a young woman. Even though nothing was proven, the Rockefellers still faced public disgrace, and so they were forced to pack their bags and find a new home. You'd think after this event, Bill would dial back his schemes, his infidelity, and focus on healing his relationships to his family. But instead, he did the complete opposite. Whilst using his fake identity of Dr. William Livingston, Bill married another woman in a different state where no one recognized him. Of course, he kept this a secret, and neither John's mother nor the other woman ever knew he had two wives. But the effect was evident. Bill was almost never around. So the Rockefellers moved from town to town, and John took on more responsibility as the unofficial head of the household. All whilst going to school, he kept finding ways to make money, manage the family's finances, and he even started giving out very small loans. Finally, the Rockefellers found a good home in Cleveland, Ohio, but now that John was 16 and nearly done with school, he wondered what the next phase of his life would be. John wanted to go to college, but by this point he had 4 siblings and a 5th on the way, and since John's father was absent even more than normal now that he had his secret other wife, John's mother relied on John to help pay for their food, housing, and education. This meant college was out of the question. John had to get to work immediately, and so just 2 months before his graduation, John dropped out of school and began looking for a job in Cleveland. He was after something big, so he made a list of all the biggest railroads, banks, and wholesale merchants in the city. However, every time John showed up to an interview, people laughed in his face when they found out he was only 16 years old. John faced rejection after rejection, but no amount of humiliation was going to stop him, and after 6 long weeks, he got an interview at a small firm that needed help with bookkeeping. When they saw John's excellent penmanship, they decided to give him a chance and told him to get to work immediately, not even mentioning how much he'd get paid. John was ecstatic, and for the rest of his life, he celebrated September 26th as a personal holiday he called Job Day. To him, it was even more important than his own birthday. Even though it was not a massive operation, John's first job taught him how to deal with suppliers, pay bills, and see the inner workings of a real business for the first time. One day, his boss came in with a check for $4,000 and put it inside a safe. John knew the safe's combination, so when his boss was gone, he opened it up just so he could hold the note in his hands, hypnotized by how much it represented. John dreamed of someday making as much money as his bosses, and so every morning before heading off to work, he began repeating to himself, "I am bound to be rich." On the last day of 1855, John's bosses gave him his payments, $50, which meant he'd only earned a little over 50 cents a day. It wasn't much, but since he'd done such a good job, his bosses raised his salary to $300 per year, the equivalent of around $11,000 today. The raise gave John something he deeply wanted, independence from his father. Now, with his mother's help, he could finally give his family the stable life they'd yearned for. And from early on in his career, John personally gave around 10% of his salary to various charitable causes. But after 2 years of diligent work, a recession slowed the business down, and one of the founders quit the firm. All of his responsibilities fell onto John, who became the company's lead accountant. However, John knew the economic downturn had caused a sharp decline in the firm's revenues, and he suspected that soon, the firm may have to close down completely. And yet, John wasn't worried. His 2 years of experience in the job had given him a huge amount of confidence, and so John was already planning his biggest move yet. John D. Rockefeller was ready to start his own company. During his first job, John had become friends with Maurice Clark, a 28-year-old chemist who worked down the street from him. Even though John was just 18 years old at this point, he developed a good reputation as a bookkeeper in Cleveland, and one day Maurice told him he was planning on starting a produce business, and suggested that they partner up together. After saving up a bit of money, they formed Clark and Rockefeller, and got to work buying and reselling grain, fish, beans, meat, and other foods. It was tough at first. John and Maurice were often exhausted from looking for customers out on the road, but owning their own business gave them immense pride. And even though he was a bit shy and quiet at first, John was a capable salesman. Because he was so mature, everyone called him Mr. Rockefeller. The older men in the industry easily trusted him, and the list of clients at Clark and Rockefeller quickly grew. In fact, their biggest problem was that they didn't have the capital needed to scale the business and handle even more clients. But John and Maurice found a smart way to solve this problem. problem. If they wanted to seek a $5,000 loan, they would go around Cleveland saying their firm was looking to invest $10,000, very publicly giving the impression that they had plenty of cash. This simple trick meant the banks were more willing to give them money, and the extra loans they got put them in a great position when the American Civil War broke out, as business picked up even more. As a devout Baptist, John was very strongly opposed to slavery, so he wanted the Union to win the war. However, John was still responsible for feeding his family of 6. If he stopped working, they wouldn't have any income. So instead of serving in the army himself, John paid $300 for a substitute and even paid to equip several more Union soldiers. The war gave a huge boost to the economy of the northern states, and Cleveland became an important strategic location for the Union. Local food prices were massively inflated, so John's produce business quadrupled almost overnight. In 1862, John and Maurice cleared a profit of $17,000, over $500,000 in today's money. Not bad for a 23-year-old, but an opportunity to multiply his wealth even more soon came across John's desk. You see, before electricity, people used to light their homes at night by burning oil inside of a lamp. Usually this oil came from whale fat, but finding and hunting down whales was costly and difficult, and sadly, some whales had been hunted down to the point of extinction. However, in 1859, someone in Pennsylvania discovered that by using a tall wooden structure known as an oil derrick, you could extract industrial amounts of crude oil by drilling straight into the ground. Mining crude oil this way was cheap, and it was fairly easy. Profits came quickly, and since so many people were made rich by the oil boom, crude oil was given the nickname Black Gold. And that's when John was introduced to Samuel Andrews, a young man who was looking for investors to build a crude oil refinery in Cleveland, which was only a day's ride away from the Pennsylvania oil regions.
Nico, relax. It's a 10-hour layover.
Andrews had a huge advantage over most of the competition. He discovered that if you applied sulfuric acid to crude oil, it would essentially purify it and turn it into kerosene. When burned, kerosene lasted longer and shined brighter than crude oil. It was a simple process, but the secret was closely guarded by the few who had discovered it. Now that John and Maurice had plenty of money to spare because of how successful their produce business was, they thought it would be wise to diversify their business, and thus they loaned Andrews $4,000 to set up his oil refinery. But to begin, they considered this as a side venture. John and Maurice kept managing their produce business and let Andrews handle the refinery by himself. Setting it up was remarkably simple, and because kerosene was a superior product to crude oil, began selling like crazy. John couldn't ignore the numbers anymore. Within only a year, the oil refinery had become the most profitable side of the business. Together, John and Maurice decided to make a bold move. They abandoned their previous business and went all in on the oil industry. However, their initial enthusiasm was met by a massive challenge. The supply of oil was always in an unpredictable state. At this point, oil had only been found in one small region of Pennsylvania, so many people thought that it would eventually run out. Whenever someone struck a massive oil field, an entire town of oil miners would suddenly form around the site, drill every last drop, and then the town would disappear just as quickly as it had formed. Because of this, there were periods where oil was overabundant and prices would dip as low as 10 cents. But on the flip side, if it seemed like the oil was running out, then prices would suddenly rise all the way up to $14. So to say that the oil market was turbulent would be an understatement. To mitigate this effect slightly, John decided to stay out of mining oil and concentrate only on refining oil. But for John and Maurice, the situation was still extremely stressful. When oil was easy to find, they weren't as profitable as prices were low, and when the wells were running dry, they feared that the last drop had finally been found and they'd soon have nothing to sell. The uncertainty was too much to handle for Maurice, and in 1865, he agreed to sell his share of the business to John. This was the tipping point of his career. Scared to his bones, but with a calm exterior, John agreed to buy Maurice's share of the company for $72,500, or $1.35 million in today's money. Maurice was cashing out, whilst John was doubling down and going all in on the seemingly risky oil business. However, it seemed like John's daily affirmation that he was bound to be rich was quickly becoming a reality, because just as the deal was going down, a gigantic new oil field was found in the Pennsylvania oil regions, finally undoing any doubt he had about oil running out. Of course, the market was still very competitive, so if John truly wanted to become as wealthy as he desired, he would have to brutally crush his competition. The year before buying his business partner's share of the company, John married a woman who shared his religious devotion. Even though he was now making good money, John bought a modest house in Cleveland where they began to raise a family. So with his home life in order and the northern economy booming after the Union Army won the Civil War, everything was ready for John to begin building his empire. Now that his partner was gone, John rebranded the company under a new name, Standard Oil, and he got to work building a second refinery and began exporting kerosene to Europe. John was confident that the oil industry would make him extremely rich, but it quickly became apparent that he needed some help. So John took on a new partner to help him run the company, a man named Henry Flagler, and the two men were remarkably similar. Like John, Henry wasn't interested in making a little money. He wanted to build an empire. That's why when John told him about his ambitious plans for Standard Oil, Henry was all in. He was also just as religious, disciplined, and determined as John. In fact, perhaps the only difference was that Henry was even more ruthless when it came to doing business. Henry approached business the same way he would approach war. The only way to win was to completely crush your enemy, and so John adopted this philosophy as well. You see, competition in the oil refining industry was quickly turning warlike. Now that others had uncovered how simple the refining process really was, Rockefeller's product was no longer unique. New brands of kerosene were popping up all over the market. So John and Henry began scheming and decided to form strategic alliances that would not only boost Standard Oil's profits, but also hurt their competitors at the same time. One example of this was when John secretly colluded with the railroads to get better transportation costs than all their competitors. At the time, oil was transported from one place to the other by an extensive network of trains, mostly dominated by 3 railroad companies: the New York Central, the Erie, and the most powerful company in America at the time, the Pennsylvania Railroad. Because of the way their routes were laid out, it was beneficial for the New York Central and the Erie railroads to carry oil to refineries in Cleveland. But for the Pennsylvania Railroad, it was more profitable to carry oil directly to New York City or Philadelphia. So the Pennsylvania Railroad declared that Cleveland would be wiped out as a refining center, and they pulled out of the city completely. After this news that the largest railroad was leaving the city, many refineries in Cleveland left the city too. This was a disaster for the New York Central and Erie railroads, who had made sizable investments in Cleveland, and they were now losing customers. So instead of joining the panicking crowd and leaving Cleveland, John saw that the Erie and New York Central railroads were in dire need for business, and he decided to use their desperation to his advantage. In exchange for a consistent flow of oil through their networks, John negotiated a deal with the Erie in which Standard Oil would get a 75% discount on the railroad's official shipping costs. And in exchange for a daily order of 60 carloads of refined oil, John negotiated another deal with the New York Central Railroad to pay $1.65 per barrel shipped, when the official rate was $2.40. So with both railroads, John now had extremely favorable rates secured. And even though the railroads were reluctant to accept these lower prices, the guaranteed consistent shipments were irresistible to them. In fact, since these railroads went from shipping all sorts of things to focusing just on oil, they could simplify their operations and boost their profits. So it was win-win for everyone. Well, except for the Pennsylvania Railroad and Standard Oil's competitors. Because of the deal, Cleveland became the largest refining center in the country, and since the Pennsylvania Railroad had abandoned the city, it was at a steep disadvantage when trying to revive their business there. And of course, the discounts John had negotiated with the railways known as railroad rebates, were kept a secret to Standard Oil's competitors, and so all the other oil businesses would have to pay the full price to transport their oil on the very same trains. And here's the thing, because John knew for a fact that his costs were now lower than all his competitors, he was able to trigger a price war. John would lower the price of his oil so that his competitors would have to do the same in order to remain competitive in the market. But since John knew his competitors were paying more than him to transport the oil and thus at higher costs, even if they charged the same price for their oil, John was still making more profit. He knew his competitors wouldn't be able to survive. So John kept slashing the prices, and eventually the price would go so low that some competitors would go bankrupt. Once they went bust, Standard Oil would have way less competition, so John could bump up the price again and charge even more than he did originally. It was brutal, but it was extremely effective. Now, John knew these railroad rebates were morally dubious. They gave bigger businesses hugely preferential treatment over smaller ones. However, it would be over a decade before any antitrust laws were passed to prevent these kind of monopolistic practices. So legally, John wasn't doing anything wrong, and thus in the meantime, this warlike strategy to crush competitors was paying off, and Standard Oil raked in enormous profits. However, there was one major problem. The massive surplus of oil meant oil prices had fallen as low as $2.40 per barrel, and as more oil fields were found in Pennsylvania, it seemed that the price would continue to fall. The remaining competition was barely hanging on. In fact, John estimated that around 90% of oil refiners were actually losing money. But John began to fear that his individual success could be overshadowed by a total collapse of the entire oil industry. John was convinced that if they were facing a system-wide problem, they needed to find a system-wide solution for it. And John's solution would be to organize an even more dominant monopoly, the likes of which had never been seen before.
Need a high-quality AI voice like this for your content? Don't be stuck without the perfect narration for your videos.
Welcome to the bustling
By 1872, John and Henry were ruthlessly expanding Standard Oil, but oil prices had dropped another 25%. They knew if they didn't do something soon, the entire industry could collapse, and they would fall right along with it. So John decided to collaborate with the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, Tom Scott. John and Scott had been rivals after the deal John made with the other two main railroads, but now, Scott was reaching out to make a similar secret deal that was even more ambitious and ruthless. Scott proposed a secret alliance between the largest railroads and a very select group of the largest refiners, which of course included Rockefeller. And thus, Standard Oil and the Pennsylvania, New York Central, and Erie Railroads all formed an alliance together under the inconspicuous name of the South Improvement Company, or SIC for short. The deal was that in exchange for a secret 50% rebate on transportation costs, John would transport all his oil exclusively through these railroads. But John wasn't content with just getting benefits for himself. He designed the deal to be devastating for his competition. For example, when anyone outside of this secret alliance transported kerosene through these railroads, Standard Oil would receive a 50% rebate from the cost of their shipments as well. These were known as drawbacks, and they meant that Standard Oil's competitors would not only be paying higher prices to transport their oil on the same railroads, but some of that money would be going directly to Rockefeller. And to top it all off, the railroads would even secretly give John detailed information about their competitors' shipments. He would know every detail of his rivals' businesses, and so he could undercut them by selling kerosene for cheaper prices. Anyone outside this secret alliance stood no chance. It was a death sentence for anyone excluded from the club, and the worst of it was, they didn't even know it. However, whilst many of Rockefeller's critics call this whole arrangement a shameless power grab, to John, he truly believed it was the best way to save the oil industry. Because as things stood with so many competitors, their product was getting closer and closer to being given away for free, as there was so much supply of oil readily available. He believed wiping out these smaller refiners would help the oil industry overall. But either way, it didn't matter, because rumors of a railroad and refiner cartel soon began to spread. When people read in the newspapers that the rates for the three most important railroads in the country had doubled overnight, they knew exactly who to blame: Tom Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad and John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil. As rumors of the alliance continued to spread, thousands of people took to the streets to protest, threatening Standard Oil and the Pennsylvania Railroad with violence, vandalism, and arson. Protesters hijacked Standard shipments and spilled their oil, and they tore the Pennsylvania's train tracks from the ground. But the final blow to the SIC came when the oil miners made their countermove and boycotted the SIC. Without a supply of crude oil, John's refineries were useless, so 2 months after it was formed, the SIC had been disbanded. It was a humiliating event, one that brought a lot of negative attention on John, but John wasn't fazed by it. He simply decided if he couldn't control the oil industry through shady backroom deals, then he would do it in public, and conquer the industry by force. John wanted to bring as many refineries under Standard Oil as he could, and to his surprise, the SIC fiasco had actually caused one important change in the industry. Despite the very public fallout of the SIC alliance, there were still whispers of a secret railroad and refiner cartel, with many people paranoid that there must still be some kind of secret deal in place between the big railroads and the big refiners. Even though there wasn't, the rumors spread everywhere. Oil refiners were scared that if Standard Oil still had a secret deal with the railroads, they would get crushed, and John decided to leverage this threat to his advantage. In a period of 6 weeks, now known as the Cleveland Massacre, John managed to intimidate 22 out of the 26 oil refining companies in Cleveland into selling out for fractions of what their businesses were actually worth. So even though the SIC hadn't gone ahead, the fear it had created pressured many refiners into panic selling their companies to John. Plus, since many other refiners were losing money anyway, John would show them his company's finances so they could see how well Standard was doing, and to prove to them that he could outlast them all. For most refiners, the choice between fighting a losing battle and cashing out was obvious. And whenever anyone sold out, John gave them only 2 options. They could either sign a damning contract prohibiting them from ever joining the industry again, or they could join Standard Oil. Since most competitors chose to join Standard, John had the brightest minds in the industry working for him. All those entrepreneurs who'd been running their own companies were now brought under the Standard Oil umbrella into one giant company. Also, when the new refineries came under Standard's ownership, they outfitted them with the latest oil refining technology, which drastically cut costs. By mid-1873, John was in control of an empire with a growing number of highly efficient refineries that together could ship out over 1 million barrels of kerosene every year. He now had a monopoly over the Cleveland refineries. However, on September 18, 1873, a day historians call Black Thursday, a series of bank failures plunged the US economy into a national recession that lasted 6 years. For the first time, oil prices dropped not because there was too much supply, but instead because of a total lack of demand. Standard began operating only 2 of their 6 main refining plants in Cleveland. And a year after Black Thursday, a single oil barrel traded for as little as 48 cents, less than the cost of an equal amount of water. So everyone from the miners to the railroads and the refiners were dreading their seemingly inevitable fate, bankruptcy. But thanks to Standard Oil's careful management of finances, excellent credit with banks, and their modernized refineries, John was one of the only refiners in the country who was able to still clear a profit. And as always, John regarded every crisis as an opportunity. He smelled blood in the water. Now, John already dominated in Cleveland at this point, which was one of the main refining centers in the country, but he knew the bleak economic conditions were a nationwide problem, and so refiners in the other refining centers like Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York were all struggling badly. And thus, John decided this was precisely the right time to acquire as many of them as he could. So John initiated a nationwide buyout campaign, and whenever anyone was reluctant to sell out, John would resort to indirect ways of pressuring them into submission. For example, he would buy all the available refining machinery and barrels, so competitors couldn't even make or package their oil. And if somehow they managed to make any oil, he would reserve every railroad for months, so they couldn't even ship it anywhere. Another one of John's brutal business tactics was to pressure the railroads to raise prices for other refiners high enough that they would soon face bankruptcy. Since he had detailed records of all his competitors' shipments, he would wait for them to be on the verge of ruin, and then he would offer to save their business by buying them up for pennies. Eventually, everyone who Standard Oil wanted to acquire was either absorbed into the growing giants or crushed under its pressure. By the time the economy was starting to recover, Standard controlled over half of Pittsburgh's refining capacity, the largest refineries in Philadelphia, and they secured a dominant position in New York as well. To exert even more control over the industry, John built a network of pipelines which brought crude oil into their refineries and pumped out refined oil in large cities. The pipelines meant Standard relied less on the railroads to transport their oil, and thus it further reduced their unit costs. And with its pipelines covering the eastern seaboard of the United States like tentacles, Standard Oil earned its appropriate nickname, the Octopus. Despite still only being in his 30s, John D. Rockefeller was now the undisputed king of oil refining, and one of the wealthiest men in the country. However, by now, too many people had been victims of Standard Oil's predatory business practices. The largest newspaper in America at the time even called the company the most cruel, impudent, pitiless, and grasping monopoly that ever fastened upon a country. John's list of enemies was growing dangerously long.
Your delicious Oreo now has 2 free packs Mario.
For the railroad companies, the oil industry was a tremendous source of business, as miners needed to get oil from wells to refineries, and refiners then needed to get it to the big cities. However, when Standard Oil began laying a vast network of pipelines all across America's eastern shore, the railroad companies were faced with the fact that one of their most important customers was making them obsolete. So Tom Scott, the owner of the Pennsylvania Railroad, decided to lay his own pipelines. But he also did something he knew John wouldn't like. He started building his own oil refineries. Now, Scott was in direct competition with John, so John interpreted this as declaration of war. He decided to launch an all-out attack against America's most powerful company. First, John cancelled all his business with the Pennsylvania Railroad and redirected all that oil to other railroads instead. Then, John lowered the price of Standard Oil kerosene, which meant that competitors had to do the same, thus reducing their profit margins and decreasing the shipment orders on the Pennsylvania Railroad. And finally, John convinced the New York Central and Erie Railroads to lower their shipping fees drastically for everyone to make sure the Pennsylvania Railroad lost even more business. And these strategies most definitely worked. To compete with all this, the Pennsylvania Railroad literally had to pay refiners to transport oil for them. Scott also had to lay off hundreds of his employees and reduce the salaries of those who stayed by 20%. But John's attack didn't just affect the Pennsylvania Railroad. Another big railroad, the B&O, had to make similar layoffs and wage cuts. And thus, John's attack on the Pennsylvania Railroad inadvertently caused one of the most violent labor strikes in American history. Dozens of people died in the commotion, and in Pittsburgh alone, the Pennsylvania Railroad lost 500 freight cars, 120 locomotives, and 27 buildings after they were torched by protesters. Even John started to get concerned by the chaos that was unfolding. Before long, the Pennsylvania Railroad, a Goliath once thought to be invincible, lost the battle against Standard Oil, and Tom Scott was more than ready to surrender. Scott was in a desperate position, and John's business partner Henry, who saw business as war, saw this as an opportunity to crush him totally. But John had a better idea, and instead moved to coordinate a massive deal with the railroads. John agreed to help the Pennsylvania Railroad survive by guaranteeing 47% of Standard's traffic to them. The New York Central, the Erie, and the B&O got the rest of it. In exchange for the steady source of shipments, John demanded a very large secret rebate on the Pennsylvania's official rates, he demanded even more detailed information about their competitor shipments, and he wanted 20 cents for every single barrel that passed through any of the railroads as well. A lot of this was similar to the secret alliance that had been proposed before, but this time John was the one who held the balance of power and could basically demand what he wanted. The railroads had little choice. And thus, the deal effectively made John one of the most powerful men in America. John basically now owned the railroads, he essentially controlled the oil industry, and had an all-seeing eye into every one of his competitors. He completely dominated Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia, and there were only a few scattered refineries in New York that weren't his. Standard Oil was now in control of about 90% of the entire oil refining industry. However, as for John's rival, Tom Scott, even though John had technically now struck up a deal with his company, the Pennsylvania Railroad never regained its footing, and Scott personally never recovered from his humiliating defeats. Just a year later, Scott suffered from a stroke and died shortly after. What's interesting here is that many years earlier, Tom Scott had been the mentor to a young Andrew Carnegie, who was to the steel industry what John was to the oil industry. Carnegie blamed the death of his beloved mentor on John, and thus a rivalry was born between Carnegie and Rockefeller, the king of oil versus the king of steel. The rivalry between these two titans of industry would intensify as time went on, but for now, both men were determined to become wealthier than the other. In the midst of all this, John was becoming quite a notorious public figure. The fight with the Pennsylvania Railroad, his rivalry with Carnegie, and his tremendous wealth and power had all taken John from a mysterious oil man in Cleveland, Ohio, to now one of the most controversial figures in American newspapers. And yet, for all his wealth, fame, and power, John didn't indulge in the extravagant lifestyle that many of his peers did. When he moved to New York, John spent his free time playing with his children instead of seeking the company of wealthy bankers or celebrities, and he rarely bought expensive clothes or luxuries. Silently managing his army of puppets from their new office in New York, John was enriched by his 90% dominance of the oil refining industry. It seemed like he could now just sit back and enjoy the fruits of their labor. But actually, the opposite was true. Even though he had achieved total dominance, the state of the industry was changing, and fast. A few years earlier, Thomas Edison patented a light bulb that gave off a powerful white light for 100 hours, and he was pushing to light the country with electricity instead of oil. Then in 1885, a huge deposit of crude oil was found in northern Ohio. These two events meant many Standard Oil executives started to panic, fearing a massive oil surplus that would take the industry back to the days when oil was priced at 10 cents per barrel. But whilst this company was panicking, John was calm as ever. By now, he was a master at turning chaotic situations into opportunities, and this was exactly the crisis he'd been waiting for. But before we get to that, let's talk about an opportunity for you, because it's been said that attention is the new oil. The people who understand how to get their message across and build an audience are the ones currently dominating in business, and that's where today's sponsor, School, can help you. School is a platform where you can create your own community or discover new ones. And having your own community means that you'll have a group of members who are naturally paying attention to your message as they engage each day. On School, you can create your own community within minutes and customize it how you want. Your members can join for free or by paying for membership. And you can share access to courses, events, bring people together, and keep your members highly engaged that Ohio's oil had one glaring problem. Even after it was refined, it had such a terrible smell that people called it skunk oil, and so nobody wanted to buy it, and it traded for as low as 15 cents per barrel. Almost everyone else gave up trying to sell the skunk oil immediately, but instead, John hired a team of chemists to study the skunk oil, and within a year, they found a way to remove the sulfur in the oil which had been causing the terrible smell. Standard was now the only company selling this new, cheaper form of oil, and this gave John a massive head start when a few years later, oil began breaking out in immense quantities in Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and California. It was now evident that America was sitting on an ocean of petroleum, and the company best poised to take complete advantage of it was Standard Oil. It was also around this time that automobiles were beginning to replace the horse and carriage, and luckily for John, the process of refining crude oil produces one key waste product, gasoline. With wealthy consumers being introduced to the automobile, Standard found a reason to transform a material they typically discarded into an immediate source of extra profits. This meant that even when the United States was thrust into another economic depression in 1893 and 600 banks had to close their doors, John was once again prospering amidst even the worst economic conditions. With John's fortune growing larger than ever, John took more of a backseat in day-to-day operations at Standard Oil and began to think more about investing elsewhere. For a man as capable in business as John, you'd expect he'd probably also be a decent investor. But if you took a look at John's personal investments at the time, you'd find most of them were deep in the red. John knew if he wanted to keep the generational wealth he'd acquired up to this point, that he needed to get his investments in order. So he hired a Baptist minister called Frederick Gates to help him. Now, it's impossible to know what John was thinking when he hired a former priest to administer his fortune. But years later, when John was asked who was the greatest businessman he'd ever met, he pointed to Frederick. And there's no doubt Frederick helped grow John's fortune much larger with a series of strategic investments. It was also around this time that John's son, John Jr., graduated from university, and John thought it would be a good idea to have Jr. learn from Frederick. Frederick taught Jr. how to invest, how to negotiate, and before long, the two of them had turned John's laughable portfolio into a wealth multiplication machine. It was at this point that John told them to start making huge investments in other industries, like buying up railroad companies, which would come in handy later. But the most critical of these investments was a long strip of land in Minnesota, known as the Mesabi Mountain Range. In this territory was a 120-mile-long vein of the highest quality iron ore found to date, potentially the largest in North America. Now, iron is the main ingredient needed to produce another important material, steel. So when Andrew Carnegie, the Steel King, heard this news, he feared that John was planning to compete against him in the steel business. And in fact, John had been planning to do this for a long time. Up until now, Rockefeller and Carnegie's rivalry had really only been about who was wealthier, but now they were in an open battle in Carnegie's territory. John was no longer content dominating the oil industry, he was now coming after the steel industry. John told Frederick and Jr. to commence mining operations in the Mesabi Range, and they undercut Carnegie by selling their higher quality ore to his competitors at dirt cheap prices. As they built up their mining operation, a rumor started to spread that John was planning to further infiltrate Carnegie's niche and build a huge steel mill. Now, over on Carnegie's side, he had a head start of a few decades in the steel industry, which gave him considerable leverage over John. But he also had two big problems. Firstly, John had a source of iron that was more plentiful and of a higher quality than Carnegie's. And secondly, Carnegie had made the mistake of assuming that iron would always be cheap and easy to find, so he hadn't made any investments in iron mines during the last few years. His blind faith had been proven wrong over time, and now his supply of the most important mineral he needed was running out. And so, hoping to save his business, Carnegie approached John, Frederick, and Jr. to make a deal. By the time the negotiations concluded, the two sides had reached an agreement. Carnegie agreed to buy a minimum of 600,000 tons of ore from John's mine every year and transport all of it, plus an additional 600,000 tons from his own mine, exclusively through John's railroads, which John now owned a few of. In exchange, Carnegie would get a secret rebate from John for supplying his railroad with so much business. It was the exact same sort of mutually beneficial secret agreement that John was used to making with railroad companies for his oil transportation, except now he was the one giving Carnegie a secret rebate. And to seal the deal, Carnegie agreed to never buy land around the Mesabi Range, and John agreed never to build a steel mill. The partnership was win-win for both men, and so it seemed they were willing to overlook their differences if it meant they'd both profit hugely, and of course at the same time, hurt both of their competitors. The agreement between these two former rivals soon made news headlines, provoking a craze on Wall Street. Investors hoped to get rich by investing in John's iron mines and Carnegie's steel mills, which both looked unstoppable now they were working together rather than competing. However, there was one man who had a bit more imagination than simply investing separately in their two companies, and that man was JP Morgan. JP Morgan realized that if he could unite John's investment with Carnegie's business under a single name, he could create a steel monopoly that was more profitable than Carnegie Steel and even larger than Standard Oil. JP Morgan called it US Steel, and if it all worked out, it could be the most valuable company in history. So JP Morgan approached John and asked him how much he would sell the Mesabi iron mines for. But to his surprise, John said that Morgan should talk with his 27-year-old son, John Jr. JP Morgan assumed he'd be dealing with a rookie. How much could this 27-year-old really know? But when JP Morgan met Jr. and bluntly asked him, "What's your price?" Jr. was not intimidated by Wall Street's wealthiest banker. He calmly responded, "Mr. Morgan, I think there must be some mistake. I did not come here to sell, I understood you wished to buy." Jr. insisted that JP Morgan had to set the price for the Mojave territory, which meant Jr. had all the power in the negotiation. Morgan was so surprised that he had to step out of his office and rethink his strategy. Eventually, he made his offer. In exchange for total ownership of the Mojave mines and the existing mining operation in it, JP Morgan offered a grand total of $88.5 million in US steel stock, just over $3.1 billion today. Later on, Morgan bought Carnegie's entire steel business and incorporated it into US Steel, and it became the world's first billion-dollar corporation. But remember, John now owned a huge chunk of that company, and his US Steel stock soon appreciated to over $200 million. Plus, thanks to the automobile boom and the need for gasoline, Standard Oil was growing into an even more powerful monopoly than it had been before. Not to mention that thanks to Frederick, John's investments were now in order too. With all of this combined, John's wealth continued to grow to unimaginable levels. It was now spread across multiple industries, and John was finally ready to step back from the business world completely. However, John never publicly announced his retirement, which was a crucial mistake, as the public still closely associated him with Standard Oil, and that would soon come back to haunt him, as John was about to be involved in the most public scandal of his career. Even though he was now retired, John still owned around 30% of Standard Oil stock, and because of the tremendous growth of the auto industry, he was actually getting wealthier in retirement than when he was working. However, because of their brutal business practices, Standard now had such a negative public image that US President Theodore Roosevelt saw it as the perfect target to fight against in his rise to power. Now, this wasn't the first time he tried. Previously, Roosevelt passed a bill that punished railroad rebates, but it really wasn't enough to get the public excited, and the end of his first presidential term was coming up. So Roosevelt detected that the public opinion of John and Standard Oil was quickly turning from a mere dislike to a passionate hatred, and that was largely thanks to a journalist called Ida Tarbell. You see, Tarbell's father was one of the oil refiners who were bankrupted by John's ruthless business tactics a long time ago. Her father's business partner even took his own life after their wealth was destroyed by John. Now, Tarbell was publishing monthly articles that told an in-depth story about the company and the man who had bankrupted her father and made her childhood miserable. As you'd expect, she didn't have many nice things to say. Tarbell managed to break through John's wall of secrecy, and so the dark history of the once mysterious Standard Oil was now in full view, with John as its protagonist. His backroom deals with railroads, his intimidation tactics, the politicians they bribed, everything was fully revealed, and the American public devoured the story. The series even exposed John's father's history of scams, his sexual abuse accusation, and they eventually discovered his second marriage, which took a heavy emotional toll on John and his family. Needless to say, John never responded to anything Tarbell wrote, and so his public image was contaminated as she publicly condemned him. And his silence only angered the public further, so in a few years, John went from one of the most private and mysterious members of the American elite to the national embodiment of corruption and greed. Now, the public was dying to see John and Standard Oil pay for their crimes. So as President Roosevelt approached the end of his first presidential term, he saw an opportunity to use the public sentiment to his advantage by making Standard Oil his enemy. In his presidential campaign, Roosevelt promised to take down the monopolies, and thus when he won the re-election, it was time to make good on that promise and wage war on Rockefeller's empire. He launched a full-fledged investigation into Standard Oil, and now the anti-monopoly laws that corrupt politicians always ignored got used to their full potential. Roosevelt announced that the government would prosecute Standard with the full force of the United States government in a historic all-out attack. Standard was charged with monopolizing the oil industry, predatory pricing, negotiating railroad rebates, corporate espionage, and secret ownership of competitors. Apart from having to fight 21 lawsuits in individual states, the federal government hit Standard with the largest lawsuit in history up to that point. There were over 1,000 exhibits, 444 testifying witnesses, and over 12,000 pages of damning evidence that Standard Oil was, indeed, a monopoly. The lawsuit was so vast that it continued years beyond Roosevelt's presidency, but his ambition to defeat Standard Oil would eventually be satisfied. The evidence that Standard Oil was a full-fledged monopoly came when Standard's profits were examined. Because they were in control of 87% of oil refining in America, 100% in some places, Standard was taking full advantage of their monopoly status and overpricing their kerosene in order to make outrageous profits. And apart from being confirmed as a monopoly, evidence proved that Standard had systematically bribed hundreds of politicians and knowingly broken multiple antitrust laws. On May 15, 1911, after being found guilty of the crimes they'd been accused of, it was ordered by the federal government to dissolve Standard Oil and reorganize its subsidiaries into separate, unaffiliated companies. After 41 years, John's empire had finally been dealt a fatal blow and was being split up. Now, of course, you'd think breaking up an empire of Standard Oil scale would be a losing situation for John. Many of his enemies, like Ida Tarbell and President Roosevelt, certainly thought this event was a cause for celebration. But what they didn't expect was that the dissolution of Standard Oil would be the most profitable event in John's career. You see, from the outside, it may have looked like Standard had been ruined by the dissolution, but actually, it was a pretty convenient time for the company to be broken up, as a lot of important changes were happening in the industry as a whole. As more oil fields were found in places like Texas and California, independent refiners were starting to find their footing in new markets faster than Standard could absorb them. The Middle East and Russia were now looking like their first worthy international competitors as well. And at the year before the verdict, gasoline had surpassed kerosene sales, and so the entire focus of the industry was changing. And because John still owned around a quarter of Standard Oil, when it was broken up into 34 different companies, he got his share of stock in all of them. And after they were open to public trading, investors nearly tripled the value of his shares. So John became even richer. At the end of 1911, the same year that Standard Oil was dissolved, John was getting close to becoming the world's first billionaire. Andrew Carnegie was now left far behind in the fight for the title of world's richest man. But now that John had achieved such unimaginable wealth, just one question remained. What was he going to do with all that money? But before we get to the next chapter, if you sell anything on